Hi, it's me, Brodie McLeod. I am still in mental hospital. Sucks a fat one. And I'm still very bored. I'm still making these videos just for the 10 people that watch them. I am going to broach quite a controversial juxtaposition today. It's kind of hard to initially explain, but it's about normalized societal and cultural stereotyping. If you go up to a guy with dreadlocks and ask him if you can buy any weed, he might give you a slap and say, just because I've got dreadlocks and I'm mixed race or whatever, doesn't mean I sell weed, you arrogant wanker. But if you go to dinner and you meet your partner's new, your friend's new partner, who happens to be Italian, and you say to them, I love Italian cuisine, I love ravioli and cannellini, I bet you make the best cannellini. Everyone at the table will not only probably broadly agree with what is a completely unfounded cultural stereotype based on a statistical paradox, a fallacy, but they will actually believe it as well. And I think that belief system is kind of at the root of a lot of prejudice and discontent. It's really easy to look at like people from Amsterdam and assume they all smoke bud. Do you know what I mean? Like some of them do. Like a lot of people in Holland do smoke weed, and it's still not right to go, I bet you can roll me a banging joint, mate. Do you want to skin up because you're from Holland and Netherlands? Sorry, that's culturally inappropriate in me, isn't it? But you get where I'm coming from. I think it just took a photo of me. Let's put it in video mode. Video's better anyway. Oh, you can see my ugliness worse though, especially I hadn't had a proper haircut this month. I just had to use those Ward clippers, and so I've got really bad hair. Maybe I should put a hat on. I'm going to put a hat on for this. It's not a very good hat. You won't have to look at me anyway. I used to wear a beanie all the time when I was younger. Does make me look a bit like a twat. That doesn't matter to me. So I've got no one to validate myself with in this fine establishment. Anyway, it's a paradox of positive stereotypes, and I wanted to explore it because I think it's journalistically kind of interesting, the way that we believe someone from France will be good at making croissant or, custard tarts or whatever. We believe that. We don't just assume it, we believe it, But if we say that French people, I don't know, steal more mopeds than British people, and you say, bet you know how to hotwire a moped, don't you, mate? Everyone rides mopeds out in France. He'd probably give you a slap as well. So, without getting slapped myself, and in the interests of addressing this kind of like, I love the word parallax. I've done some research which I'll read to you, and probably no one will ever watch. But it just is so different, and one of them is completely fine, the other one's completely different, but they both work on the same mechanistical, social and mathematical statistical dynamics. The asymmetry of inference, ecological fallacies, moral parallax, and the social acceptability of cultural generalization. So the introduction, the architecture of belief and the statistical mind. In the landscape of social cognition, the human mind operates less as a precise calculator of probabilities, more as a pattern-seeking engine designed by evolution to categorize, predict, and infer the attributes of the specific from the behavior of the general. We are by nature inductive reasoners. We observe the forest to understand the tree. We study the herd to predict the behavior of the animal. This cognitive heuristic, while essential for the survival in the ancestral environment where rapid categorization meant the difference between life and death, creates a profound logical errors in the modern world. Errors that aren't merely mathematical, but deeply sociological, ethical, and of course moral. At the heart of this friction lies the ecological fallacy, a formal error in the interpretation of statistical data, where inferences about the nature of specific individuals are deduced from inferences about the group to which those individuals belong. It is the mathematical sin of assuming that the average properties of a population are embodied in each constituent member. They're not. When a demographer observes that a specific neighbourhood has a high crime rate, the ecological fallacy is the cognitive leap that assumes that any given resident of that neighbourhood is a criminal. It's a failure of logic that erases individual variance in favour of group averages. However, the human relationship with this fallacy is not one of consistent rejection. Rather, we grapple with a countervailing force, the equality fallacy, a consensual delusion dominant in modern social psychology and the humanities. Right, this fallacy posits that the equal group outcomes are not only desirable but the natural state of affairs, often necessitating the denial of observed differences to maintain social cohesion. The equality fallacy suggests that statistical disparities between groups are either illusory, solely the role of systemic oppression, or moral failings of the observer, rather than reflections of diversion or cultural environmental realities. The tension between these two fallacies generates what can be termed as a moral parallax, a shift in our moral judgment depending on the observational position we occupy, and crucially, the valence, sort of positive or negative, I don't know what valence means apart from like bed sheets, of the generalisation being made. We exist in a paradoxical cultural state where it's socially mandatory to reject negative statistical truths about a group when applied to an individual, like correctly identifying the ecological fallacy, yet socially mandatory to accept and celebrate positive statistical generalisations about a group when applied to an individual, flagrantly flouting the ecological fallacy. I don't think it's done the maths here. I don't know if I can explain it properly, but this report provides an exhaustive examination of this phenomenon. It identifies 4 nations, South Africa, United States, Mexico, and Italy, that present extreme differential contrasts in crime statistics compared to the United Kingdom, illustrating the mathematical severity of the ecological fallacy. It then juxtaposes these negative truths with the benevolent stereotypes that we freely accept, exposing root causal hypocrisies in our normative presumptive biases. We will explore why it is socially acceptable to tell a French friend they must be a genius at making custard tarts, a mathematical delusion, while being socially abhorrent to suggest that they're proficient at hot wiring cars, a statistical probability, thereby unmasking the inconsistent machinery of our social politeness. The taxonomy of fallacies theoretical framework. To understand the social mechanics of generalization, we must first design the logical instruments at play. The distinction between the ecological fallacy and the equality fallacy is not merely academic, it's the friction point where data meets ideology. So the ecological fallacy, the error of division, right? So the term ecological fallacy was actually formally coined by sociologist W.S. Robinson in his seminal 1950 paper, which demonstrated that correlations found at a group level, the ecological level, do not necessarily hold at the individual level. It's a very important bit of social science. Robinson's showed that while states with higher immigrant populations might have higher literacy rates, it was, fallacious to assume individual immigrants were more literate. In fact, the data showed they settled in states that already had high literacy. The mechanism of the error, right, here's what I was going to try and explain to you, but hopefully I haven't read this document before it opened, you see. The fact that it included parallax is probably just an example of my supernormal clairsentience or just a coincidence, whatever. The mechanism of error, the fallacy occurs when the properties of a macro set are distributed to micro units. So here's how it works. The statistical reality, for example, crime rates. Crime rates, for instance, are tail events, even in a nation with a catastrophic homicide rate of 50 per 100,000. That would calculate as 99.95% of the population did not commit homicide that year. To treat an individual as a carrier of the group's homicide attribute is a statistical error of the highest magnitude. The group average is a composite, not a template. The social consequence in the context of negative traits, crime, disease, poverty, society has correctly identified that ecological fallacy leads to prejudice. When we teach that you cannot judge a book by its cover or a person by their nationality, this is the mathematically correct position. The equality fallacy, so the delusion of sameness. While ecological fallacy is a statistical error, the equality fallacy is a sociological or ideological one. In the simplest terms possible, the equality fallacy is the belief that because all humans should be treated equally in dignity and rights, they must therefore be statistically identical in capacity, behaviour and cultural output. The mechanism of belief. This fallacy manifests as a refusal to acknowledge aggregate differences. So if data shows that group X performs differently to group Y in a specific metric, for example crime rates or educational attainment or income, the equality fallacy compels the observer to reject the data as flawed or to assume the disparity is solely the result of external bias regardless of the empirical reality. So a consensual delusion is noted by psychologist Joseph Forgas. The equality fallacy is one of several consensual delusions in academia, derived partially from neo-Marxist conflict theories. It operates on the premise that equal outcomes are not only natural result of human interaction. Therefore, any statistical evidence suggesting that one culture produces more crime or more pastry chefs than another is viewed with the suspicion if it is negative, but embraced if it's positive. Bit of a kind of double blind sort of bullshit vibe going on there, isn't it? You know, blank slate. The fallacy relies on what they call the blank slate theory, that humans are infinitely malleable and that cultural geography leaves no imprint on the individual's behavioural likelihoods unless that imprint is a positive, celebrated trait. The intersection, benevolent stereotyping. So the collision of these two fallacies gives rise to benevolent stereotyping. Researchers indicate that stereotypes are sorted among two axes, warmth and competence. So positive stereotypes: Asians are good at math, women are nurturing, Italians are great cooks. These are ecologically fallacious. Not every Italian can cook. However, because they ascribe competence or warmth, they're socially acceptable. They're prejudice masquerading as praise. The paradox: we use the equality fallacy to shield individuals from negative ecological inferences, rejecting the idea that a Mexican is involved in cartels, but we discard the equality fallacy to shower individuals with positive ecological inferences, accepting the idea that a Mexican values family above all. So here's four nations, a study in different contrasts. So to illustrate the severity of the ecological fallacy, we must examine nations where the statistical contrast with the United Kingdom is not merely marginal, but multiplicative. Yeah, we look for differential contrasts of 5 times, 20 times, or even 40 times. In these instances, the statistical pressure to generalise is immense, yet the moral imperative to resist for negative traits is equally strong. We'll examine South Africa, homicide; the United States, gun violence; Mexico, kidnapping, impunity; and Italy, vehicle theft. For each, we'll list the taboo crime statistic along with the accepted positive generalisation. So case 1, South Africa versus the United Kingdom. South Africa presents perhaps the most stark statistical contrast to Britain in terms of lethal violence. Historical legacy of apartheid combined with high economic equality and proliferation of firearms has created a sustained high crime environment that is statistically distinct from the UK. The taboo reality, intentional homicide. The negative attribute here is lethal violence. The statistical disparity is so vast that it represents two entirely different realities of public safety. So the statistics for South Africa: the intentional homicide rates hovered between 40 and 45 per 100,000, that's per capita. Population depending on the year. 24-25 reporting period, South Africa consistently ranks in the top 10 most dangerous nations for homicide globally. UK statistics: homicide rate is approximately 1 to 1.1 of 100,000 of the population. So specifically England and Wales has one of the lowest homicide rates in the world. Differential contrast, a randomly selected area in South Africa is statistically 40 times more likely to be the site of a murder, you could assume, than the equivalent area in the UK. There's a chart. You can just sort of see that. I've just read it. The ecological fallacy application, so socially unacceptable. It is mathematically fallacious and socially abhorrent to assume that a South African individual encountered at a professional conference in London is violent. Despite the rate being 40 times higher than the UK, the probability of any specific South African being a murderer is statistically negligible, 0.04%, suggesting to a South African guest, I'm intimidated by you because statistically you're from a nation of murderers, would be viewed as a gross violation of social norms, a demonstration of xenophobia, and a failure to see the individual. But the accepted delusion, hospitality and resilience, Ubuntu. While we reject the negative generalisation, we embrace a positive one that's equally sweeping. The positive generalisation is South Africans possess the spirit of Ubuntu. They are the most resilient and hospitable people on earth. The social assertion, it's commonplace to assert that South Africans have a unique capacity for Ubuntu, which is a philosophy of interconnectedness and warmth. I am because we are. We generalise South Africans. We generalise that South Africans are uniquely resilient survivors who make the best hosts, attributing a philosophical ideal to the genetic or cultural makeup of the entire population. The hypocrisy. We feel entirely comfortable asserting that a South African individual possesses Ubuntu based solely on their nationality. This is accepted as a compliment. However, structurally, it's identical to the negative inference. It assumes a group trait, hospitality culture, is inextricably pleasant in the individual present. We accept the positive delusion that all South Africans are warm, while rightly rejecting the negative delusion that all South Africans are violent, even though the statistical variance for warmth within the population is likely just as high as the variance for violence. Case study 2, United States versus the United Kingdom. United States serves as the primary outlier among developed nations regarding gun violence. The contrast with Britain, which enforces some of the strictest gun control in the world, creates a massive differential. So the taboo reality of firearm-related homicide. The negative attribute is the prevalence of gun death. So United States statistics, the firearm homicide rate is approximately 4 to 5 per 100,000, with total firearm deaths, including suicide, reaching much higher levels. In some states, like Mississippi, the rate rivals nations in civil conflict. There's more people dying there than either in war-torn countries. But in the UK, firearm homicide rate is roughly 0.05. So often reported as 30 to 50 deaths per year in a population of 67 million. The differential contrast, an American environment is roughly 90 to 100 times more likely to produce a gun homicide than a British one. But the ecological fallacy application, socially unacceptable, assuming that an American tourist in London is carrying a concealed weapon or is trigger happy in any way, is a textbook ecological fallacy. Despite the massive statistical disparity where the US has more guns than people, the vast majority of Americans do not carry guns daily, and an even smaller fraction ever use them for violence. To tell an American, I'm nervous around you because Americans are gun nuts, is offensive, discriminatory, and dismissive of the millions of Americans who advocate for gun control. The accepted delusion, though, innovation and optimism, the positive generalisation that Americans are the most innovative, free-thinking and optimistic people on earth, that'd be sweet. You said that to your American friend at the dinner table, he'd be like, yo, you're right, man. Yeah, I mean, we've got some great thinkers and movers and shakers and whatever, but a social assertion, you Americans, you just have the entrepreneurial spirit. It's in your DNA to disrupt industries. So there we've got the hypocrisy. We readily attribute the success of Silicon Valley or Hollywood or to a national character of optimism that resides in every American. We treat innovation as a trait that the individual American inherits by virtue of birth. This is essentialism, the same cognitive mechanism that drives racism, but because the content's positive, competence or agency, it's filtered through our social norms as cultural appreciation. We believe the innovation statistic applies to the individual. Equality fallacy of positive traits. Where were we? Just doing the ecological fallacy of negative traits. So case study 3, Mexico, another example, versus the United Kingdom. So Mexico's struggle with organised crime, cartel violence has created pockets of extreme danger that contrast sharply with the UK's relatively stable security environment, particularly regarding kidnapping and disappearances. The taboo reality, kidnapping and impunity. The negative attribute is lawlessness, specifically kidnapping and forced disappearance. Mexico statistics. Kidnapping rates in Mexico are notoriously difficult to track due to underreporting, but official investigations and NGO estimates place the rate significantly high. So in high-risk states, the rate of disappeared persons is a national crisis, with over 115,000 people missing. The impunity index suggests over 90% of crimes go unpunished. In the United Kingdom, however, kidnapping in the UK is statistically present, roughly between 7 and 11 per 100,000. But the nature of the crime is fundamentally different. In the UK, the vast majority of kidnappings are non-ransom custodial interferences, parents taking children against court orders. In Mexico, the statistic represents violent abduction for ransom or cartel warfare. So the differential contrast, while the raw rate might look close to due definitional differences, I'm sorry I'm pronouncing all these words wrong, it's on meds. The lethality and organised culture of medical kidnapping creates a contrast of safety versus moral peril. The homicide rate is, differential is 25 times. So 25 versus 1. So you got that metric there, as I never do charts or tables. The ecological fallacy applications are socially unacceptable, deeply offensive to joke or imply that a Mexican individual is involved in organised crimes, cartels, or is lawless. To look at a Mexican national and presume criminal intent, or to joke about them knowing people in the underworld, is the essence of prejudice. It applies the traits of the Sinaloa cartel to the civilian. But the accepted delusion, family values, familismo, the positive generalization. Mexicans have the strongest family units and make the best food in the world. You say that to him, he's going to be chuffed as, pleased as punch, isn't he, really? But the social assertion, the Mexican dedication to family is beautiful. You'll take care of your abuelas and stay together no matter what. The hypocrisy. We readily assert you must have a wonderful tight-knit family to a Mexican acquaintance. This assumes that the cultural norm of familismo is present, I said there instead of present, in every individual. It ignores the reality of broken homes, domestic violence, which exists in all cultures actually, or individual isolation. We treat the positive stereotype, family values, as a cultural fact, and the negative statistic, cartel violence, as a stereotype, even though these negative statistic is based on recorded death tolls and the positive one is based on a romanticised anecdote. Again, now we've got Italy, right? So turn now to specific comparison requested, which was vehicle theft. That's what I put into the prompt. So while France has high vehicle theft rates, Italy provides the special cultural juxtaposition of motorbikes and pasta. The taboo reality, vehicle theft, motorbikes. The negative attribute is property crime, specifically the theft of motor vehicles and scooters. Italy statistics. Vehicle theft rates in Italy are high, particularly regarding two-wheeled vehicles, motorbikes and scooters. In regions like Campania, in Naples, the density of motorcycle theft is among the highest in Europe. Italy records approximately 131,000 plus. That's a fucking lot, isn't it? Car thefts annually, with a theft rate of around 232 per 100,000 in some years. In the UK, we also have high vehicle theft, about 140, 50 to 190 per 100,000. However, The differential is often perceived in the specific category of scooters and motorbikes in urban centres, and historically Italy has held a higher rate of vehicle theft than the UK in comparative data sets, for example 50% more in some rankings. So then you've got the differential contrast. While not as extreme as the homicide rates of USA, the contrast is sort of 1.5 times or even twice as much in favour of Italy having a higher theft rates, specifically regarding motorbike stereotype. The ecological fallacy application, socially unacceptable. If one were to decline to lend a motorbike to an Italian friend by joking, "I'd better not, statistics say you Italians are 60% more likely to steal it," the remark could be met with a stunned silence. It's a mathematical fact that the rate is higher in Italy, but applying that propensity to an individual Italian is a fallacy. It implies dishonesty and criminality based on geography. An accepted delusion, gastronomy, pasta. If you say to your Italian mate that Italians make the best pasta in the world, it's in their blood, or say you are an Italian, you must cook amazing pasta, you have to teach me your grandmother's recipe, then we're in this hypocrisy at the same dinner table telling the Italian guest, like, "I bet you make amazing carbonara, it's in your DNA," is considered a compliment. Yet this exact same logical operation as the motor and motorbike theft accusation, it assumes that a national statistic or reputation for culinary skill resides in the individual. We believe the Italian individual is a good cook, or at least possesses the spirit of good food, while vehemently denying they are a vehicle thief, despite the fact that individual variance for cooking skill is just as wide as for criminal propensity. So the equality fallacy, a simple explanation. Before analysing the social interaction, we must clarify the equality fallacy in simplest terms possible as requested. So the equality fallacy is the mistake of thinking that because people should have equal rights, they are already equal in every way. Maybe read that again. So just because we think we should treat each other equally, we kind of have this conflation. We think we're all the same. We're not all the same. Equal rights doesn't mean equal wrongs, if you see what I mean. So imagine a teacher has two classes. Class A scores 90% on a math test, class B scores 50%. The reality, the classes perform differently. The equality fallacy, the belief that it is impossible for class A to be better at math than class B. Therefore, the test must have been wrong, or the teacher made a mistake, or we should pretend the scores are the same to avoid hurting class B's feelings. In society, it's the belief that groups of people, nations, cultures cannot possibly behave differently from one another. Oh, no, I'll do. Statistics show one group commits more crime or makes better cars. The equality fallacy tells us to ignore the crime statistic because everyone is equal, but oddly allows us to keep the better car statistic because it feels nice. It's a mental filter that deletes differences to maintain the polite fiction that everyone is the same, which is just like fucks up, in a way, isn't it? The journalistic conversation, a study in moral parallax. The following is a constructed journalistic narrative exploring the social juxtaposition of these fallacies in a real-world setting. Scene: a dinner party in a converted loft in Shoreditch, London. The guests are a cosmopolitan mix. Sarah, British host; Jean-Luc, French architect; David, American tech entrepreneur; Elena, Italian researcher; and Tabo, South African finance analyst. The wine is open. Pre-installed filter of polite society is humming. The appetizer is the accepted delusion, positive traits. The conversation turns to food. Sarah brings out a tray of custard tarts. "I wouldn't dare bake these with Jean-Luc in the room." Sarah laughs, gesturing to the Frenchman. "You French, you have butter in your veins. It's intimidating. You make the best pastries in the world. It's just a fact." Jean-Luc smiles, nodding. "It's true. We respect the dough." Everyone nods. The table has collectively agreed to commit the ecological fallacy. They've taken a national representation, France has good bakeries, and applied it to Jean-Luc. He must be a baking authority, even though Jean-Luc might buy his bread from a supermarket and burn toast regularly. David, the American, chimes in. It's like the Italians and pasta, Elena. I bet you cringe when you see what we do to spaghetti in the States. It's a tragedy, Eleanor jokes. We have standards. Exactly, David says. It's cultural DNA. The main course, selective blindness. The conversation shifts to travel. David mentions he's moving to California. Oh, lucky you, Thabo says. California grows the best weed in the world. Everyone says so. Absolutely, David agrees. The agriculture there is top tier. Here, the group applies a product quality statistic to a region and freely associates it with the people living there. It's a cool generalisation. Then the conversation drifts north. David mentions a business trip to Montreal. I love Canada, Sarah says. So safe, much safer than the US. Actually, David said, did you know a civilian is statistically more likely to be shot in Montreal than in London by a significant margin? And the tables goes quiet. The mood shifts from wry observation to uncomfortable silence. Well, Sarah says, shifting in her chair, you can't really say that. Canada's very peaceful, and you can't just judge a whole city by crime stats. That's a bit reductive, isn't it? The parallax, when the topic was weed, being positive or cool, the generalisation was accepted. But when the topic was shootings, sort of negative, scary, the generalisation was rejected as reductive. The pivot, so the forbidden comparisons. David, emboldened by the wine, presses the point. But we just said France has the best pastries. Why is it okay to say France has the best tarts, but rude to mention that statistically France has a significant higher rate of car theft in the UK? Jean-Luc raises an eyebrow. Is that true? It is, David says. But if I said, Jean-Luc, hide your keys, you're French, I'd be a bigot. By saying Jean-Luc, bake a tart, you're French, makes me a charming host. And Germany, Thabo adds, we all say German engineering, best cars in the world. We love that stereotype, but Germany also has the highest population of neo-Nazis in Europe. If I said Germany makes the best Nazis, I would be thrown out of this house. God, Thabo, that's horrific, Sarah whispers. But it's the same logic, Thabo insists. We take the data point, highest prevalence of X, and we stick it on the person. But when we do it, if X is a nice thing, if X is a bad thing, we remember that ecological fallacy exists. So the climax is basically a root hypocrisy. It's the equality fallacy, Elena says. We want to believe everyone is equal. So if the data says Italians steal motorbikes, which, by the way, in Naples is a real problem, we delete that data because it makes Italians look worse than British people. We want to protect the dignity of that group. But if the data says Italians make great food, that makes us look better or special. So we keep that data. So we're delusional, David asks. We're polite, Sarah corrects. No, Thibault says, we are hypocrites. We literally believe the positive generalisation. We believe Jean-Luc is a baker. We believe Eleanor is a chef. We hold beliefs that are mathematically tantamount to delusions because they make the world feel colourful and nice. But we treat the rest of the negative truths as lies. The dinner party pauses. The moral parallax is exposed, and the guests realise they're navigating a world where truth is secondary to agreeableness. Well, Sarah says finally, breaking the tension, I don't care about the statistics. Jean-Luc, pass the wine. It's French, so it must be the best. They all have a drink, happily accepting the fallacy because it tastes good. So analysis of the paradoxical moral parallax, the journalistic vignette, I don't know what that word means. I do, obviously, but I can't say it properly. Above explores the moral parallax, the phenomenon where ethical acceptability of the statistical inference changes based on the desirability of the trait. And we've got these pre-installed filters which appear to have cognitive filters that sift through incoming statistical information. So South Africans are hospitable. Filter, does this enhance the status of the group? If yes, accept as cultural wisdom, apply to individual. Right, my fucking battery's about to die, so I've been using this book by Lily Allen to support my reading today. You can buy it in all good bookshops. In fact, I might move these books over to the corner so I can balance my charger and continue with this boring video you probably don't even want to watch. Right, power in. Now I've got to sort of balance it. somehow where I can read it, that will do. So the pre-installed filter, where was I? South Africans have a high homicide rate. Does this enhance the status of the group? No. So the action is to reject as stereotyping, apply logic, the ecological fallacy to dismiss. So the root causal hypocrisies. Truth, pardon me, the ecological fallacy is technically incorrect to apply to any group stat to an individual. Jean-Luc is not necessarily a baker. Tabo is not necessarily a murderer. Cohesion, the equality fallacy, we need to interact with people. Positive stereotypes act as a social glue. They provide safe topics, conversation, compliments, and ways to signal respect, benevolent stereotyping. But negative stereotypes act as a social solvent. They dissolve trust and create fear. The hypocrisy. We pretend to care about individualism, not judging people by their group, but we only actually practice it when the group judgment is negative. When the group judgment is positive, we practice essentialism, believing the group defines the person. So beliefs tantamount to delusions. The most striking aspect of this research is not that we are polite, but that we are believers. That people actually believe these opinions based on generalization. These form part of their core understanding of themselves, the world, moral and ecological, sociological paradigms. When a person says Germans make the best cars, they're not usually lying to be polite. They believe that, they believe that German culture instills a unique engineering spirit in its people. They hold a metaphysical belief in national character. However, when confronted with the statistic that Germany has high neo-Nazi population, the same person does not believe culture instills a Nazi spirit. They instantly revert to sociological explanation. That's just a marginalised subgroup. It doesn't represent real Germany. We define the real nation by its positive outliers, Mercedes-Benz, pasta and pastries, and dismiss the negative outliers, so neo-Nazis, car thieves, cartels, as not representative, even if negative outliers are statistically significant. So where do we go from there? Conclusion is the agreeable delusion. The investigation into interplay between the ecological fallacy and the equality fallacy reveals a human cognition that's deeply bifurcated. Have some more vape before I mispronounce another word. So we're not rational actors objectively parsing data. We're social actors navigating a minefield of status, taboo and tribal affiliation. The ecological fallacy remains a steadfast mathematical rule. You cannot know the individual from the group. South African, not a murderer. American, not a gunman. Mexican, not a kidnapper. And an Italian, not a bike thief. The probabilities, while higher than in Britain, remain infinitesimally small at the individual level. To assert otherwise is to commit an error that is both mathematically wrong and morally repulsive. However, the equality fallacy and our social norms create a selective blindness. We have a pre-installed filter that permits us to generalise largely on the basis of agreeable aphorism. We hold beliefs that, Italians are romantic, Japanese are disciplined, French are culinary geniuses that are just as scientifically flawed as their negative counterparts. We allow ourselves to hold beliefs that are mathematically tantamount to delusions, that a randomly selected French person is like the best baker of pastries on the earth, while we rigidly enforce the logic that prevents us from suggesting they are a proficient car thief. Ultimately, the moral parallax serves as a social function. It allows us to compliment strangers and build bridges using shorthand of stereotype, while preventing the alienation that would come from fear-based profiling. We choose to be mathematically wrong so that we may be socially right. We live in a world where the truth of a generalisation is determined not by its R-squared value, but whether it makes us smile at the dinner party table. Here's some tables and stuff. I don't know if it's going to be appropriate, but I'm going to show you. No, I'll just leave it. It was a really good bit of maths, right? that said that like out of 100,000 people, even if you had one nation with 5 times more homicides than the other, like 99.9% of people from that nation would not be a murderer. So the statistical probability, even with 2 comparative capita metrics, like compared to each other, you would still find that the statistical probability is like 99% that they ain't a bad person, they ain't done nothing wrong to anybody, Anyway, that's 40 minutes of that. I'm gonna what we're gonna do, put this ridiculous hat on. This one's much better. This isn't designed in any way to be insulting, and I can think of people who probably are going to be like watching this, or maybe probably have watched some of it and just sort of think I'm mocking them. I'm not trying to be horrible to anybody. I'm just trying to think of interesting stuff to put on the internet, because I'm fucking bored and more morbidly depressed and have just fucked up really badly. Anyway, have a good day. Thank you for watching.